Hello everybody. Hello from Winnie and I, and we're in Renaissance class today. So Winnie's been doing really well. She's been taking walks, she's been running around, and she's really happy that we're home with her now. But anyway, Winnie, as usual, you've done your little part, you've said good morning, and now it's time for you to go. Well, boys and girls, today we're going to talk about what daily life was like for the people during the Renaissance. So during the time from about 1350 to about 1600, people began to enjoy more luxuries. They had nicer clothes, they had finer foods, they enjoyed the arts more. There were more and more craftsmen and artisans and merchants who actually developed into a middle class, and these people had more money than, for example, the peasants and the farmers did. But they were not royalty, they were not nobles, they were a middle class of basically merchants. Of course, there were many people who still had difficult, hard lives. The daily life of the farmer and the peasant was mostly work, and they had little chance to improve their position. So let's talk about we're going to talk about various headings now. So first of all, we're going to talk about housing. The typical home for a poor farmer was basically a one-roomed hut, but wealthier merchants began to live in larger homes. So these homes, compared to our homes, would have been dark and cold, but compared to how the peasants and the farmers lived, they were living in luxury. Of course, they didn't have running water, let's remember that. They didn't have bathrooms, and their houses were actually pretty smelly, but they were beginning to live better and better lives. Well, what was their food like? Most people ate bread and stew. The rich people had all sorts of fancy and interesting meals. Peasants didn't get a lot of meat to eat because meat was expensive and rare, and in order to preserve the meat, you had to have salt. Well, salt was really expensive, and spices were really expensive. So people who lived near the coast, well, they were able to eat fish. That was good. The wealthy people during the Renaissance ate much better than the peasants. They enjoyed having huge feasts with lots of fancy dishes. Like, for example, they would have many more meats. They would have roast beef, and they would have pig, and they would have stag, and they would have turkeys. And the roast would be boiled in large vats and then basted with juices and with rose water. They enjoyed their feasts during the Renaissance. Big weddings, big festivals, all kinds of interesting food. Often the merchants and the nobles would eat large game birds like swans and peacocks. Sounds very unusual for us today, but they did. They ate swans and peacocks, even cranes. And after cleaning and cooking the birds, they would often reattach the feathers as decoration to make it look really fancy. There was also time for lots of meat to be eaten by these wealthier people. Mutton, chicken, pheasant, venison, turkey, rabbit, ham. And the desserts were called the fruit course. During that course, they were served jellies and nuts and cheeses. So the food was delicious, but what did they drink? They couldn't really drink the water, right? Because the water was dirty. So they probably drank lots of beer and lots of wine. If they were in Italy and France, they basically drank beer. If they were in England and Germany, if they were in Italy and France, I'm very sorry, they basically drank wine. But if they were in Germany and England, they basically drank beer, which they called ale. And most people ate with their hands. Few of them did have forks. They had 2 prongs on their forks. And they only really the wealthy people used forks. All right, so that's their food. What about their clothing? Well, clothing was a really important status symbol during the Renaissance. The wealthy people dressed in fancy clothing. Fashion and clothing was an important part of Renaissance life. It was especially true for the wealthy, who used fashion to display their success. A wealthy person would have a variety of clothes made from the finest of materials, from furs and from silks and from beautiful velvets. A peasant, on the other hand, had maybe 1 or 2 sets of clothing, very ordinary, drab, brown clothing. But what did the men wear? The men wore colourful tights or stockings, and they had a shirt and a coat. The coat was generally very tight-fitting. It was called a doublet, and they often wore hats. The women wore long dresses with high waists, puffy sleeves and puffy shoulders, and wealthy women would have elaborate jewelry made of gold and ornamented with expensive jewels like pearls and sapphires, and sometimes their dresses were even embroidered with gold and silver thread. Glorious. Hairstyles. Hairstyles changed throughout the Renaissance. For men, long and short hair went in and out of style, and the same was true of beards. At times, the hair was cut short, and they had short, pointy beards. Other times, it was popular to have long hair for men and a clean-shaven face. Blonde hair was considered especially stylish for women, and they would often bleach their hair to make it as blonde as possible. They also wore wigs and fake locks of hair made out of yellow or white silk. Were there rules about clothing? Oh yes, depending on where you lived, there were all sorts of laws and rules about clothing. Laws were often passed to try and keep the lower classes from wearing fancy clothes. In some areas, only nobles were allowed to wear fur, so there were lots of laws about clothes. In England, there were a very long list of laws. They were called sumptuary laws that specified who could wear what types of clothing. And depending on your station in life, you could only wear clothes that were made out of certain materials and of certain colors. With some interesting fun facts about Renaissance fashion. People were not very clean during that time. They rarely bathed. They washed their clothes maybe once or twice a year. Jewish people were often forced to wear clothes to identify them as being Jewish. In Venice, the men had to wear a yellow circle on their shoulder, and women had to wear a yellow scarf. A white complexion was very, very desirable for women. As a result, they often wore hats or veils to keep them from getting suntanned. What about religion during the Renaissance? Well, the main religion of Europe was Christianity, and the main church was the very, very powerful Catholic Church. However, there were new ideas during this time, including a new Christian church called Protestantism, and a new way of thinking which placed values on human accomplishment and the study of nature. Entertainment. Oh, those Renaissance people loved to be entertained. Jugglers and dancers and musicians, all sorts of entertainment. The people went to festivals, they went to sporting events, they played games such as chess and checkers and backgammon. As I said, music and dancing were very popular during the Renaissance. Perhaps the biggest event that took place was Carnival, that took place just before Lent each year. People would have big parties, they would dress up in costumes for this wonderful, very, very fun-filled masquerade. Shopping and money. Where did people shop? Well, you know how we go to the farmer's market today? Similar to what they did. They had marketplaces in towns. Smaller towns would have specific market days, and local merchants and craftsmen would bring their goods, they'd set up little stalls, and they'd try and sell their items. Money wasn't even regulated at that time. So each major city had its own money, and the value of the coins could change on a regular basis. Difficult to deal with. How were children treated during the Renaissance? So we know that the Renaissance is a time of great change, and even the way children were treated changed as well. At the start of the Renaissance, children were treated like little adults, and they were expected to behave as adults. They were expected to talk and dress just like adults. And as soon as they could, they were expected to begin working. They generally even weren't hugged or cuddled or made a fuss of. However, as people gained more free time and merchants became wealthier, they began to treat their children differently. Wealthy children were usually treated with lots and lots of love, and they had lots of free time to play and enjoy their childhood. Schools were primarily for wealthy people. A wealthy child, especially a boy, either attended college or they had private tutors. And they mostly learned grammar and arithmetic. But a good number of them also learned philosophy and Latin and, of course, public speaking. A lot of emphasis was placed on public speaking. We have some interesting facts about daily life in the Renaissance. Dance, in the form of ballet, was invented during the Italian Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries. The first violin was invented during the Renaissance in 1555. And of course, we know from previous lessons about the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, which gave rise to the availability of so many more books. So many more people could learn, so many more people could read, and knowledge was available to almost everybody. So that's our lesson today about life in the Renaissance for most people. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'm sending you lots of love and hugs. Bye for now.